Hey DJ Tech Tools, Ian Golden here. Special treat for you today. We've got the S5 controller in the studio. I'm going to take a detailed dive on this controller and answer your questions about the killer features you're wondering about to make the decision if this one is right for you. One way to look at the S5 controller is a simplified version of the S4. It takes all those controls and puts it into a streamlined package, takes away the jog wheels, gives you two nice, beautiful screens, and control over the stem decks. Here I've got a stem track playing. It's got 3 parts. And what I can do is use these 4 pads to isolate each of the 4 parts. On the bottom one, I've got the drums. I can hold down that pad and basically turn the drums up or down. Here's some sort of a groove. And finally, I've just got the vocals on top. Now, the way NI has this shipping by default is with sort of a toggle function. Let me show you how that works. If we go into the S5 functions, we're going to change this right back to toggle. So what that basically means is you can select 1, 2, 3, 4, or all of the stem decks, and then control them using the browse knob. So now I'm turning up 2 different stems at the same time, the drums and the groove. This basically takes over the loop knob, which controls the filters. So now I'm filtering 2 stems at the same time, and the browse knob, which is now controlling volume. This means that your browse and your loop knobs no longer work for browsing or looping. The browsing is not a big deal, but the looping is. I found this to be a really big pain in the butt because maybe I was controlling stems and I just needed to set a loop quickly. But I can't because my loop knob no longer works. I need to go in, deselect all the stem decks before my loop knob recovers, and now I can set a loop. The way to solve that is to just change this from toggle to hold, which I think is an acceptable compromise. And now to control a stem deck, all you have to do is hold down one of the pads and you're now controlling that stem deck. But as soon as you release the pad, it goes back to regular browse knob and regular loop encoder. So that's how you control the stem decks. The other thing you can do is assign effects. It's not terribly intuitive. You hold down the shift knob and then you can turn the effects on for each of the different stem decks. Let's hear how that works. Let's put on some crazy effects, something really big. Okay, so right now the effects are just on the vocals. Right now they're on the lower groove, and right now they're on everything. So in that way, you can route effects to each of the stem decks or to all of them as a whole. A lot of you also asked about remix deck control. So let's switch down to a different deck, and now we see the remix deck. Pretty straightforward. What we've got here are a couple of single one-shots. Let's stop these. And some loops. You can also do routing of effects, and you can loop the whole deck. You don't have detailed control over pitch and some of the other things like you did with the S8. If you're doing basic 4-deck mixing and you just want to layer a few loops and a few one-shots on top of your set, this is going to be great. You've got this convenient deck switch button here, which allows you to go into your remix deck, trigger some loops, throw off some one-shots, and keep going with your set. Many of you have asked about the auxiliary inputs, and this controller has 2 of them. So you've got a RCA input, which you can do a CD player or your iPhone. You can't do a turntable because it's not a phono level, only a line level. And you also have a mic input. Now, both of these are controlled somewhat digitally if the unit is unplugged. So if your unit somehow was unplugged or you had to restart your computer, this is nice because you do have a safety mechanism. Basically what you do is you hold down the aux button and turn the loop encoder, and that will give you control over one of the 2 inputs. So if we turn on aux, check 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, Our microphone works even though we're not connected to the computer, and the same goes with your auxiliary input. So you could play your iPod in case your computer crashed in the middle of a wedding or some kind of other show. That is great. One thing I don't like so much though, is that if your computer is connected, it doesn't work the same. So now if we want to hear these inputs, we need to route them through a deck, which has pros and cons. The con is that you lose a deck. So here in the software, I've got deck number 4 set up as a live input. So it allows me to route any kind of input to this particular deck. So if we have a microphone routed to the input, then what we can do is put that mic into a deck, essentially, into a channel in the software, and it comes back out the software and through the controller. So now we're connected to the computer, and we're using the computer to process the microphone. So that means we can add crazy effects, including things like masher, which can be silly and fun. I had a lot of fun with that earlier today, using things like your voice to create hi-hats and bass drums and other cool stuff. So that's helpful, but you do need, of course, use up a deck. Not the end of the world, you've got 3 others for it. Many of you also asked if you can do final control, if you can use a set of turntables to control one of the decks because you no longer have a jog wheel. That would make a lot of sense. Unfortunately not, because you do not have phono inputs. In theory, maybe you could set it up where you had a phono converter and it ran into the aux input and you used that as a vinyl control signal. Maybe that might be possible, but it's not designed to do that at all. This is pretty much all you have. Instead of 2 jog wheels, you have these touch faders, which still work pretty well. If we turn off this loop and scroll around the track, let's go ahead and hear what that sounds like. You have a little scratch control, or if the deck is stopped, you have a needle drop. So I just scrolled back to the beginning of the track. So maybe you could get really good at scratching with the touchpad. And in general, I found that if your tracks are beat graded well, and if the BPMs are accurate, this is completely sufficient. Of course, you do not have a pitch fader, so if you need to make adjustments to the BPM on the fly in your set, that is a lot more challenging. So that means mixing old disco records that float, mixing hip-hop tracks where you're changing tempos and doing things on the fly. This all becomes a little bit more difficult. But if you're mixing dance music and it's all beat gridded and the BPMs are accurate, you probably never really even need to touch these touch strips, as everything will remain pretty well in sync. So let's talk about whether or not this controller is right for you for different groups of people. You have an S2 or an S4. Should you upgrade to this guy? For starters, you're going to get a much cleaner interface. I think this guy looks great and it works really well. It's very intuitive. You're also going to get access to stems, and you're going to get the screens. The screens alone, to me, are worth the $200 upgrade. You now have effects, views into your effects, so you can look at exactly what you're doing without needing to glance to the computer. This is priceless, definitely worth the $200 in my opinion. The biggest thing is that you'll lose the jog wheels. And as I've said before, if you're playing open format music where you're mixing between tempos, you're doing a lot of pitch adjusting and you're doing a lot of tempo adjusting, I would advise people to stick with the S2 or the S4, just because those are more flexible controllers that are going to deal with multiple formats a lot easier. However, if you're playing dance music and you really want to get inside of the music, breaking apart the stems, syncing up 4 or 5 loops at the same time, bringing in remix decks, I think this is a no-brainer. You definitely want to move up to the S5 from the S4. Now, let's say you jumped ahead and you bought the S8, or you're wondering, should I get the S8 or should I get the S5? The biggest thing to consider is how much more portable the S5 is. It fits in most backpacks and it's a lot lighter. This is something that you're going to realistically take to your friend's house, to a house party, even to the club. The S8, I think this really lives in your house and is kind of the center of your digital DJ world. So if portability is a factor, I think the S5 really wins out on that fact alone. You do lose the mixer functionality. This is a big thing. You can't route turntables and other sources of audio into the S5. It's really all about controlling digital signals. While you do lose those mixer controls, and you lose some of the dedicated stem features like independent faders controlling each of the stems, I think what you gain is a much cleaner, more simple interface. And for those of you who were on the S4, when you switch to the S8, it's really a completely different user language. A lot of the common controls like sync, deck, browse, loop have moved in completely different places on the S8. The S5, on the other hand, takes a lot of the principles of the S4 in terms of layout and usability and makes it much more condensed, efficient. For that reason, I have to go with the S5 every time because I think it's more fun to play on and easier to understand. One thing you might be considering is other controllers. There's not just NI gear on the market, there's also a lot of stuff from Pioneer, for example. Really excellent controllers with jog wheels and controls and other things. The one reason I would say that the S5 is probably a really good option for you if you're using Traktor is because of the integration with the screens and stems. Particularly with stems where you really need to see and understand what parts you're muting or not muting, what parts are coming up. A quick glance down tells me, oh, there's a vocal part right there. I can loop and isolate that. That's clutch for actually being able to work with this new format, and you're not going to get that on any other controllers. In summary, I think NI may have a hit on their hands with this controller. It's a more logical update to the S4 at a much more reasonable price. I think a lot of people are going to enjoy playing with this controller because it's easy, fun, and doesn't have too many controls, unlike the S8, which I think goes a little overboard. If you found this video helpful and you enjoy our editorial coverage, I would love if you would support our store by following the link underneath me where we actually sell S5s and have an amazing staff of professional DJs available to answer all of your questions. They can help you pick the right gear, set up your gear, or just give you answers to common questions about what does what. We really need your support in the store to continue creating great videos like this.